The bridge of the Indomitable hummed with quiet efficiency as Captain Elena Vasquez reviewed the day's stellar cartography, data, and the Outer Veil Nebula stretched before them like a cosmic canvas painted in purples and blues, and the ship had been charting this region for 3 months without incident, and the crew had settled into a comfortable routine. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison sat at the communications station, and her fingers danced across the holographic interface as she monitored the usual background radiation and cosmic noise, and then she froze, and her eyes widened as something unusual appeared on her screens. "Captain," she said, and her voice carried an edge of urgency. "I'm picking up something strange, and it's definitely—" Artificial Vasquez stood from her command chair and moved to Morrison's station, and the young officer brought up the audio file. And when she played it, the bridge fell silent, and even through the static and distortion, the desperation in the alien. The voice was unmistakable, and the words tumbled out in a panic-stricken rush. "This is Keltherin Station 7, and we are under attack, and they are taking us, and please anyone. And we need help, and they are harvesting, and oh gods, they are still alive. When in please respond, and our children, and anyone please." The message cut off abruptly, and Morrison looked at her captain with haunted eyes, and Vasquez felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Can you clean that up and get me coordinates, Vasquez?" asked Morrison. Nodded and worked her console, and within minutes, the computer had processed the signal and triangulated its origin, and a star system appeared on the main view screen, and it was only 6 light-years away. The Rinith system, Morrison reported database says it's home to the Keltherin species, and they're a peaceful insectoid. People and low galactic integration score. Vasquez turned to her navigation officer and commander. James Chen was already plotting a course before she could ask. "We can be there in 14 hours at maximum acceleration," Chen said, and his jaw was set, and his dark eyes were hard. "Make it 12, Vasquez ordered, "and get me everything we have on the Keltherin, and I want to know what we're walking into." Indomitable surged forward, and its fusion drives burning bright against the cosmic darkness, and as they traveled the ships, AI compiled what little information existed about the Keltherin people, and they were described as gentle herbivores who had achieved space travel only 2 centuries ago, and their civilization was built on principles of cooperation and harmony, and they had no standing military, and only basic defense forces. Captain called out the tactical officer, and Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been reviewing the distress call's metadata. This signal was broadcast on all emergency frequencies, and not just to us, and they sent it to everyone in range. "How many other ships could have received it?" Vasquez asked. Webb checked his readings and frowned. "At least 15 other civilizations would have picked this up, and some much closer than we are." The implication hung heavy in the air, and if other species had received the call and hadn't responded, then something was very wrong. As they approached the Rinith system, the sensors began picking up debris, and lots of it, and Chen brought the ship to a cautious sublight speed, and what appeared on the view screen made several crew members gasp. The orbital space around Keltherin's primary moon was a graveyard, and shattered station modules tumbled through the void in escape pods. And some were intact, but many were torn open, and their contents exposed to vacuum, and among the wreckage moved massive shapes, and they were like nothing in any human database. "What am I looking at?" Vasquez asked quietly. Webb enhanced the image, and the things came into focus, and they were enormous, and each one easily the size of a small city, and their holes were organic and metallic at once, and they pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence, and long tendrils extended from their bodies. And they were methodically gathering debris and wreckage, and even the escape pods. "They're collecting everything," Webb said, and his voice was hollow, including the survivors. As they watched, a tendril wrapped around an intact escape pod and drew it into a gaping maw on the creature's underside, and even across the distance, the humans could see the pod's distress beacon. "Wink out. Get us closer, but keep us hidden in the debris field," Vasquez ordered. "Morrison, and send a tight beam transmission to any Keltherin vessels, and let them know we're here to help." The Indomitable crept forward, and its stealth systems engaged, and they moved like a ghost through the orbital graveyard, and Morrison sent the message, and waded in for several minutes. There was nothing, and then a response came through human vessel. And this is refugee ship, Gentle Dawn. And please do not approach the harvesters, and you must flee while you can, and no one can fight them. And they have been the terror of the galaxy for 3,000 years. Vasquez took the communication herself. This is Captain Vasquez of the Earth vessel, Indomitable. And we received your distress call, and we're here to help. And can you give us information about these harvesters? There was a long pause, and when the response came, the alien voice seemed confused. You came in, but we sent the call 6 days ago. And no one ever comes, and the protocol is to abandon the system and run. Oh, we're not running, Vasquez said firmly. Now tell me everything you know about these things. The Keltheran designated as speaker Velthus provided the information. And the harvesters were ancient, and no one knew their origin, and they appeared every few decades, and selected a system and stripped it of all biomass, and they converted living beings into fuel and building materials, and no military force had ever successfully opposed them, and the galactic community's strategy was simple evacuation and abandonment. How many of your people are still on the moon? Vasquez asked. 15 million, Velthus said, and the words were heavy with grief. We could only evacuate 50,000 and the rest. And they are being processed now, and we can hear their final transmissions in Captain Vasquez. Why did you come? And your species will only die with ours. Vasquez looked at her crew and saw her own. Anger reflected in their faces, and Chen's hands were clenched into fists, and Morrison had tears on her cheeks, and Webb's expression was cold and dangerous. We came because you asked for help. Vasquez said simply, and we need you to do something for us, and send a message to Earth and to the Terran Defense Fleet, and tell them we need immediate military support at Rineth, and tell them it's a sapient rights emergency, but they will take weeks to arrive, Veltheus protested. You cannot possibly hold against the harvesters for that long in one exploration. Shipped against their entire fleet. Vasquez smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Speaker Veltheus, and you're about to learn something about humans, and we're from a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years, and we got very good at killing back, and we'll hold, and you just get that message to our fleet. She cut the transmission and turned to her crew. All right, people, and we've got about 3 weeks until reinforcements arrive, and Webb and I want every weapon system we have operational, and I don't care if you have to weld mining charges to the hull and Chen and find me tactical advantages in this debris field, and Morrison and coordinate with the Keltheran refugees, and I want to know everything about harvester patterns and behaviors, ma'am, Chen said carefully. We're an exploration vessel, and we're not rated for combat, and especially not against something that's been terrorizing the galaxy for millennia. Then we'd better get creative, Vasquez replied, because I'll be damned if we're going to watch 15 million people get harvested while we run away, and we're humans, and we don't abandon people who call for help. The crew moved to their tasks, and the Indomitable began its transformation from explorer to impromptu warship, and outside the viewports, the harvesters continued their methodical work, and completely unaware that something new had entered the equation, and something that didn't follow the galaxy's rules about prey and predator. Speaker Veltheus watched the human ship disappear into the debris field and tried to understand what had just happened, and in 3,000 years of harvester attacks, no species had ever stayed to fight, and the mathematics of survival were simple: and evacuate and rebuild elsewhere. Accept the loss. But these humans and these Deathworlders from the distant planet called Earth, and they had chosen to stand and fight and chosen to hold a defensive position with a single ship against an unstoppable force of Velthus, didn't know whether to feel hope or horror, and the humans were either the bravest beings in the galaxy or the most foolish, and perhaps both. What Velthus didn't know was that the message to Earth had been sent, and somewhere far away, a fleet of human warships would receive news that one of their vessels was in danger in protecting alien refugees against impossible odds, and the Keltheran had no concept of what that message would unleash. The observation deck of the refugee ship Gentle Dawn was crowded with Keltheran survivors, and they pressed against the transparent aluminum viewports and watched as the human ship moved through the orbital debris with impossible grace, and the Indomitable was tiny compared to the harvesters, and yet it didn't flee Speaker. Velthus stood among the crowd, and the elderly Keltheran's forearms were folded in a gesture of deep concern, and beside Velthus stood a young human who had shuttled over from the Indomitable, and Dr. Lisa Park was a xenobiologist, and she had come to examine injured Keltheran and assess their medical needs. "Your captain is going to get everyone killed," Velthus said. Quietly, Park looked at the speaker with calm brown eyes. "Captain Vasquez knows what she's doing, and we've studied the harvester movement patterns for the last 6 hours, and they're predictable." Velthus's antennae quivered with agitation. "They are unstoppable in 4,000 years. They have harvested without opposition, and 16 species have tried to fight them, and all 16 are extinct." Park nodded slowly. "I've read the reports, but I've also read why those species failed, and they tried to fight the harvesters in direct combat and using the same tactics they used against other civilized species in naval broadsides and formation flying and honor codes." "And your people will do differently?" Velthus asked. "We don't have honor codes in warfare," Park said, and her voice was matter-of-fact. "We have victory or death, and we cheat and we lie, and we use every dirty trick we learned from 10,000 years of killing each other, and the harvesters think they're apex predators, and they've never met humans." Velthus turned to study the young human, and Park was small by Keltheran standards and barely reaching Velthus's mid-thorax, and yet she spoke of warfare with casual familiarity and as if violence was as natural as breathing your species. "Frightens me, Velthus," admitted Good Park replied. "We frighten ourselves sometimes, but we also protect what we consider ours, and you called for help, and that makes you ours." Now, on the Indomitable's bridge, Captain Vasquez reviewed the reconnaissance data, and the harvesters operated in a pattern that made sense for unopposed predation, and 3 massive bioships orbited the moon and deployed smaller harvester drones, and these drones descended to the surface and collected living Keltheran and brought them to processing centers, and from there the victims were transported to the main bioships for conversion. "They're not even defending themselves," Webb observed. "They have no point defense systems and no combat shields, and they've never needed them because no prey fights back," Chen added. "They're like sharks in an ocean where nothing has teeth." Vasquez studied the tactical display, and her mind was working through possibilities. "The drones are the key, and if we can disrupt the collection process, we slow down their operation and buy time. We have 23 mining charges left from the asteroid survey," Webb reported. "We can rig them as proximity mines and plant them in the drone flight paths do it," Vasquez ordered, "and I want teams working on converting our cargo bay's mass drivers into weapons, and we use them for launching survey probes, and they can launch other things too." Chen pulled up a schematic. "Captain, and if we strip the reactor shielding from storage bay 3, we can use it as armor plating for the port side, and we'll take radiation exposure, but we'll survive a few more hits," Vasquez finished. "Make it happen and rotate crew through rad treatment as needed." Over the next 12 hours, the Indomitable transformed, and mining charges became improvised torpedoes, and survey equipment became weapons and cargo containers. It became armor, and the crew worked with desperate efficiency in sleeping in shifts and eating ration bars while standing watch. Dr. Park returned from the gentle dawn with critical information, and the Keltheran had provided her with detailed maps of their moon's surface, and including the processing centers where millions of their people waited in terror. "They're keeping them alive," Park reported, and her voice was tight with controlled anger. "The harvesters want fresh biomass, and they process the victims while conscious, and the Keltheran can hear their screams through the communication network." The bridge was silent for a moment, and several crew members looked physically ill, and Vasquez felt rage building in her chest, and cold and focused rage that demanded outlet. "Then we're going to hurt them," she said quietly. "We're going to make them pay for every single person they've taken," and Webb and launched the first mine spread. The Indomitable moved silently through the debris field and deploying its improvised weapons, and the mining charges were set to proximity detonation and calibrated to ignore Keltheran vessels and target only harvester technology. And within the hour, the trap was set. A wave of harvester drones emerged from one of the bioships and they moved in perfect formation toward the moon's surface, and their tendrils already extending in anticipation, and they passed through the debris field where the mines waited. The explosions lit up the orbital space like a string of new stars in 17. Drones were destroyed instantly in their organic components vaporizing in nuclear fire, and the remaining drones scattered in their formation broken and confused on the lead harvester. Bioship, something that might have been awareness stirred, and for the first time in 3,000 years, something had struck back and something had hurt them, and the bioship's primitive intelligence couldn't process this new information. Vasquez watched the tactical display and allowed herself a small smile. That got their attention, and now let's see how they respond. The response came quickly, and the bioships began launching more drones, and hundreds of them, and they swarmed toward the debris field where the attack had originated and seeking the threat they're looking for, as Webb said, and they'll find us in about 3 minutes then. Let's not be here when they arrive, Vasquez replied Chen, and get us moving. And use the debris for cover and want a running engagement. The Indomitable dove deeper into the orbital graveyard and its engines carefully modulated to minimize detection, and behind them the swarm of harvester drones searched with increasing aggression, and the trap had worked, but now came the hard part in survival. Over the following days, a strange new kind of warfare emerged in the Rineth system, and the Indomitable would strike from hiding and destroy a group of drones or damage a processing center with improvised missiles and then vanish back into the debris before the harvesters could respond, and it was guerrilla warfare in space, and hit and run and ambush and retreat. The Keltherin watched in amazement, and their entire understanding of the universe was being rewritten, and warfare wasn't supposed to look like this, and it was supposed to be formal and structured and honorable, and the humans fought like they had no honor at all. They fight like prey animals. One young Keltherin said to Speaker Velthius, "It's like creatures being hunted." No, Velthius corrected gently. They fight like predators who learned their craft by being prey first, and they know both sides of the hunt. On the 8th day, the Indomitable managed to disable an entire processing center by ramming it with a cargo shuttle packed with reactor cores, and the explosions saved 12,000 Keltherin, who were awaiting processing, and the pilot ejected at the last moment and was recovered by a search team. By the 10th day, the ship was showing serious damage and hull breaches in 40 locations in life support operating at 60%. And ammunition critically low, and the crew was running on stimulants and stubborn pride, and everyone looked like walking corpses, but they kept fighting. Dr. Park worked in the medical bay around the clock and treating everything from radiation, poisoning 2 shrapnel wounds, and one young engineer named Tom Bradley refused to leave the engine room despite a broken arm and claiming that the fusion reactors needed him. "You need medical attention," Park insisted. "The engines need me more," Bradley replied. "If they go down, we're dead anyway, and I can splint the arm and keep working." Park wanted to argue, but she understood, and they were all making impossible choices and doing whatever it took to hold the line. Just one more day. By the 14th day, the harvesters had adapted, and they began moving in tighter formations and deploying more aggressively, and the easy ambushes were no longer possible, and the Indomitable was forced into increasingly risky engagements. Captain Vasquez looked at the calendar and then at her exhausted crew, and they had held for 2 weeks, and 1 more week until the fleet arrived, and just 1 more week. Captain Chen said quietly, "We're not going to make it, and the ship is falling apart, and we're out of tricks." Vasquez looked at the tactical display and at the 3 massive bioships that were slowly tightening their search pattern, and Chen was right, and they had bought time and saved over 100,000 Keltherin, and but the mathematics. "We're clear then, we make our last stand count," she said. "If we're going down, we're taking as many of them as we can, and for humanity. And for the Keltherin, and for every victim they've harvested across 3,000 years." The crew straightened at their stations, and fear was visible in their eyes. But so was determination, and they were humans, and they knew how to die fighting. Day 17 arrived with the Indomitable listing badly to starboard, and half its systems were offline, and the crew was down to 38% operational efficiency, and Captain Vasquez stood on a bridge that smelled of burned electronics. In human sweat and blood, and despite everything they were, still fighting, Lieutenant Morrison had stopped sleeping entirely, and she ran her communication station with eyes that had dark circles deep enough to hold shadows, and she coordinated with the Keltheran refugees and tracked harvester movements and kept Earth updated on their increasingly desperate situation. Captain She croaked, and her voice was raw from exhaustion. The lead bioship is moving, and it's coming straight for us. Vasquez checked the tactical display, and the massive harvester had apparently decided that the annoyance needed to be eliminated directly. It was moving with purpose toward their last known position and bringing its full mass to bear. How long until it reaches us? Vasquez asked. 37 minutes at current velocity, Chen replied, and his hands trembled slightly as he worked the navigation controls, and he had been on duty for 14 hours straight. Wow. Looked up from tactical, and his face was gaunt. Captain, and we have 4 mining charges left, and 1 partially functional railgun and point defense is completely offline, and we can't win this engagement. No, Vasquez agreed, but we can make them remember us and Morrison, and send a message to the Gentle Dawn and tell them to get all refugee ships as far from this position as possible. She turned to her crew and looked at each face, and these were good people and brave people, and they had held far longer than anyone had a right to expect, and now they would make their final stand. I want everyone to know, Vasquez began, and her voice was steady, despite everything, that it has been my greatest honor to serve with you, and we came out here to explore the stars and to discover new wonders, and instead we found people who needed help, and we stayed and we fought and we held, and no matter what happens in the next hour, and the galaxy will remember that humanity doesn't abandon those who cry for help. The crew was silent for a moment, and then Morrison spoke up. Captain, and message from Speaker Velthus and the Keltheran want to know if we need them to stay and to fight alongside us. Vasquez smiled despite the situation. Tell them no, and tell them to run and to survive and to remember, and someone needs to tell the story of what happened here. The Indomitable began its final preparations, and the remaining mining charges were loaded into the launch tubes, and the railgun was charged to maximum capacity, even though the power drain left life support at critical levels, and every crew member who could hold a weapon was armed in case. The harvesters attempted boarding. Dr. Park had transformed the medical bay into a command post, and she monitored the ship's internal systems and rerouted power where it was needed most, and kept the dying ship functioning through sheer force of will and technical expertise. Bridge Park called over the intercom, I'm showing a massive power surge in the bioship, and it's charging some kind of weapon system. Confirmed. Webb replied, they're going to hit us with everything they have and impact in 20 minutes. Vasquez made her decision, all hands to escape pods, and that's an order, and I'm staying to pilot the ship for the final run, and everyone else is getting off. Negative, Captain Chen said flatly. We're not leaving, and you need a crew to run this ship, and we all volunteered for this, and we all stay. Morrison nodded. He's right, Captain, and besides, and someone needs to work communications. One by one, the bridge crew refused the evacuation order, and in the engineering section, and in medical, and throughout the ship, and every single crew member chose to stay, and they were going to die, and they all knew it, but they would die together. Bioship loomed larger on the view screen, and it was massive beyond comprehension, and its organic hull pulsed with sickly light, and tendrils writhed across its surface, and at its center, a massive orifice opened, and something glowed within. 20 seconds to weapons range, Webb announced. Then let's give them hell. Vasquez ordered, fire everything we have. The Indomitable's railgun fired, and a tungsten slug accelerated to a fraction of light speed, and it tore into the bioship's hull and ripped through organic tissue and metallic structures, and the mining charges followed, and nuclear fire blossomed against the massive creature. The bioship shuddered, and its weapon charge disrupted, and for a moment the humans dared to hope, and then it recovered, and the massive weapon fired, and a beam of concentrated energy lanced toward the Indomitable. Brace for impact, Vasquez shouted. The beam struck, and the Indomitable's forward section vaporized instantly, and the ship tumbled and atmosphere vented from a dozen. New breaches and secondary explosions rippled through the engineering section and the fusion reactors. Went into emergency shutdown, and the bridge Morrison screamed as her console exploded and Chen's navigation station went dark, and Webb was thrown against the wall, and Vasquez felt something break in her chest as she was slammed into her command chair through blurred vision. She saw the bioship adjusting its position for another shot and preparing to finish them, and the Indomitable was dying and tumbling helplessly and defenseless. Vasquez tried to speak and to give one final order, but blood filled her mouth and darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, and she had failed, and they had held for 17 days, but it wasn't enough, Dan. Then Morrison's console, which shouldn't have been functioning, flickered back to life, and she stared at it through tears and blood in her hands. Flew across the controls, Captain, she whispered. Captain and new contacts, and oh my God. Vasquez forced her eyes to focus on the main view screen, and for a moment she thought she was hallucinating, and thought the head trauma was making her see things. The space around them lit up with faster-than-light exit flashes, and one after another. Warships dropped into real space, and they were massive and bristling with weapons, and they flew the flag of Terra 63 ships appeared in a perfectly coordinated fleet maneuver, and they moved with the precision of a predator species that had been fighting wars since before recorded history, and at their head was the dreadnought Terrible Swift Sword on the bridge of the Terrible Swift Sword Admiral. Kwame Okonkwo surveyed the tactical situation with cold eyes, and he saw the crippled Indomitable, and saw the massive harvester bioships, and saw the orbital graveyard that had once been a peaceful civilization. His tactical officer provided a rapid assessment, sir, and we have 3 capital-class targets, an estimated 47 smaller vessels, and unknown weapons capabilities, and the Indomitable is critically damaged and reading multiple life signs, but fading medical teams prepare for emergency evac of the Indomitable. Okonkwo ordered, and get Captain Vasquez and her crew out of there, and they've earned their rescue. He stood from his command chair, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. All ships, and this is Admiral Okonkwo, and today we face an enemy that has terrorized the galaxy for 3,000 years, and they harvest sentient beings for fuel, and they have no mercy, and they have no honor, and they have never been opposed by a military force. The fleet waited, and every ship ready, and every weapon hot. They're about to learn what happens when you threaten human allies, Okonkwo continued. They're about to face the full military might of Terra, and I want every single harvester vessel destroyed. And no survivors, and no escape pods, and no quarter given. He paused and then added, they showed no mercy to the Keltherin, and we will show them exactly the same consideration in fleet and advance and weapons free. The Terran defense fleet surged forward, and it moved like a single organism and coordinated through quantum-entangled communication. Networks and 63 warships bearing weapons, designed to kill other humans, and weapons that had been perfected through millennia of warfare. Lead bioship began charging its main weapon again and targeting the approaching human fleet, and it had destroyed countless vessels with this attack and had never been opposed. The humans didn't give it time to fire railgun salvos from 15 ships, struck simultaneously in tungsten penetrators. Traveling at relativistic velocity, tore through the bioship's hull in the impact. Energy was equivalent to nuclear weapons, and organic tissue vaporized and metallic structures shattered the bioship. Tried to regenerate and tried to use its adaptive capabilities, but it had never faced damage on this scala. Nuclear pumped X-ray lasers fired next and coherent radiation beams carved the bioship into sections, and each section was targeted individually and systematically destroyed, and the humans weren't just killing it, they were erasing it. Target 1 destroyed. The tactical officer reported moving to Target 2. The second bioship attempted to flee, and it began accelerating toward the system's edge and toward faster, denlight jump distance, and the humans. Launched pursuit drones and small autonomous vessels packed with antimatter warheads. Drones caught the bioship before it could jump in 30 simultaneous Antimatter explosions engulfed it, and when the light faded, there was nothing left but expanding plasma. Third bioship attempted a different strategy, and it launched all of its remaining harvester drones, and thousands of them, and created a living screen between itself and the human fleet. The destruction of the three main bioships had taken less than 4 hours in the Terran defense. Fleet moved with mechanical efficiency and hunting down every remaining harvester. Presence in the Rinith system, and the humans weren't satisfied with victory, and they were pursuing extermination. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the terrible Swift Sword and watched as Sirkin destroyed teams methodically swept every cubic kilometer of orbital space, and smaller harvester vessels tried to hide in the debris field and tried to blend with the wreckage, and the human sensors found them. "Anyway, sir," reported Commander Sarah Reeves from Tactical, "we've located a cluster of harvester escape pods attempting to reach the system's outer planets, and they're running on minimal power and probably hoping we'll miss them." Okonkwo's expression was carved from stone. "Dispatch hunter-killer drones, and no survivors." Reeves hesitated for just a moment, "sir, and they're not fighting back. And they're clearly retreating. They weren't retreating when they were harvesting." "Keltheran children," Okonkwo replied coldly. "Execute the order, Commander." The hunter-killer drones launched, and they were small and fast and utterly merciless, and within minutes, every harvester escape pod had been reduced to scattered molecules, and even the remains were destroyed, and nothing that could potentially regenerate was allowed to survive. Throughout the fleet, similar conversations were taking place, and many human officers were uncomfortable with the systematic annihilation, and they had been trained for warfare against other humans and enemies who followed rules and fought with honor, and this was something different, and this was pest control. On a galactic scale, in the medical frigate Mercy's Hand, Dr. Park had been transferred along with the surviving Tasiv crew of the Indomitable and Captain. Vasquez was in surgery and fighting for her life, and 3 cracked ribs and a punctured lung, and severe radiation exposure, but the fleet's medical team was the best in human. Space Lieutenant Morrison sat in the waiting area, and her arm was in a cast, and her face was covered in healing burns, and Chen was beside her, and his leg was broken, and Webb was in the next surgery bay and undergoing treatment for a severe concussion. "We made it," Morrison said quietly. "I can't believe we actually made it." Chen nodded slowly. 17 days and 1 damaged exploration vessel against an enemy that had never been defeated, and we made it. A nurse approached, and a young man with kind eyes and exhaustion written across his features. "Captain Vasquez is out of surgery, and she's going to make it, and the doctor says she's stubborn enough to survive anything." Morrison laughed, and then cried in relief, washing over her in overwhelming waves. And they survived, and they had held the line, and the fleet had arrived just in time elsewhere. In the system speaker, Velthius stood on the observation deck of the Gentle Dawn and watched the human fleet work, and the Keltheran had never seen anything like this, and the humans moved with absolute purpose and absolute coordination, and they were terrifying and magnificent. Young Keltheran, named Thren, approached Velthies, and the youth's carapace still showed the pale coloring of recent molting speaker, and the humans are destroying everything, and they're not taking prisoners, and they're not offering surrender terms, and is this how they wage war? Velthius was silent for a long moment before responding. "No, young one, and this isn't war, and war is what civilized species do. When they have disagreements, and war has rules and protocols and honor codes, and what the humans are doing, and this is extermination, and this is what apex predators do to threats they deem unacceptable, but the harvesters are retreating." Thren protested. "Some of them are clearly trying to flee, and the humans are hunting them down anyway." "Yes." Velthus agreed, "because the humans understand something we never learned, and that sometimes mercy to a predator is cruelty to its future victims, and the harvesters have harvested for 3,000 years, and the humans are ensuring they will never harvest again." On the lunar surface, human marines had deployed to the processing centers, and what they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and millions of Keltheran had been awaiting processing, and kept alive and kept conscious, and the harvesters' methods were efficient but not quick. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez led her squad through Processing Center 7, and they moved through corridors of organic technology and followed the sounds of screaming and what they found made several of her marines physically ill. The Keltherin were held in massive biovats, and their bodies, partially dissolved and still aware, and still feeling everything in the process, was designed to extract maximum biomass and efficiency. Over Mercy Command, Rodriguez said into her radio, and her voice was shaking with controlled rage. "We need medical evac immediately, and we have, and God, we have millions of victims, and they're alive. And they're conscious." The rescue operation that followed was the largest humanitarian effort in human history, and medical ships from the fleet deployed to the lunar surface and worked around the clock to extract survivors and treat injuries that defied description, and many Keltherin didn't survive the rescue, and the trauma was too severe. But millions did survive, and they were pulled from the biovats and given emergency treatment and sedated against the pain, and they would live to see their families again and to rebuild their civilization. Rodriguez stood outside processing center 7 after her squad had cleared it, and she looked up at the stars, where the human fleet was still hunting harvesters, and she understood now, and understood why Admiral Okonkwo had ordered complete extermination. Some things were too monstrous to be allowed to exist on the bridge of the terrible Swift Sword. The tactical officer provided an update. "Sir, and we've eliminated 97% of harvester presence in the system, and we're tracking the remaining units, and they're attempting to reach faster than light jump distance all pursuit vessels and maintain engagement." Okonkwo ordered, "I want confirmation of destruction on every single unit." A communication request came through from the Keltherin refugee fleet, and Okonkwo accepted it, and speaker Velthius appeared on the view screen. "Admiral Okonkwo," Velthius began, and the Keltherin's voice was filled with emotion. "On behalf of my people, and I must express our, and I don't have adequate words, and you saved us, and your Captain Vasquez held the line, and your fleet arrived, and Speaker Velthius Okonkwo said gently, 'You don't need to thank us, and you called for help, and we answered, and that's what civilized beings do,' but no one else answered," Velthius said. "We sent the distress call to 16 different civilizations, and only humanity responded." Okonkwo's expression hardened. "Then those 16 civilizations have something to answer for. But that's a discussion for another day, and right now. We need to focus on rebuilding your world and eliminating the harvester threat and establishing security protocols to ensure this never happens again." Over the next several hours, the human fleet completed its systematic cleansing of the Rinith system, and every harvester vessel was located and destroyed, and the humans deployed sensor buoys throughout the system and established a defensive perimeter, and sent scout ships to neighboring systems to ensure no harvester forces were regrouping. The galaxy watched through long-range sensors and through quantum-entangled communication relays, and a dozen civilizations had refused to help the Keltherin, and now observed as humanity demonstrated what help looked like when delivered by a species that had learned warfare through millions of years of survival. Earth, the news spread rapidly, and images of the rescued Keltherin, and of the processing centers, and of the harvesters' monstrous efficiency and public opinion solidified instantly, and the Keltherin were under human protection now, and anyone who threatened them would face the full wrath of terrain. The Galactic Council Chamber's emergency sessions were convened, and representatives from hundreds of species debated and argued and panicked, and they had maintained peace through strict protocols and through rules of engagement, and through the understanding that some threats were too dangerous to confront. Humanity had just broken every one of those protocols. Ambassador Chenwei represented Terra at the emergency session, and she listened to the accusations and the demands and the fear, and then she stood to address the council. "You're afraid of us," she said calmly. "I understand, and we just demonstrated a capacity for violence that shocks you. But let me ask you something, and where were you when the Keltherin called for help, and where were your fleets and your warriors and your moral outrage?" The council chamber was silent. "The harvesters operated for 3,000 years, Ambassador Chen continued. "They harvested billions of sentient beings, and you all knew about them, and you all had protocols for dealing with them. And those protocols were to run away and to abandon whoever they chose to target." She looked around the chamber and made eye contact with representatives from a dozen species. "Well, humanity doesn't run, and we don't abandon. It's people who call for help And yes, we're capable of terrible violence, but that violence is in service to a simple principle. And that no one should have to die alone and screaming and begging for help that never comes. But you exterminated them, protested a representative from the Sivith Confederation. You didn't offer surrender terms, and you didn't take prisoners, and you violated every convention of civilized warfare. 3 months after the Battle of Rineth, the galaxy had settled into an uneasy new reality, and humanity had not returned to Earth and had not withdrawn their fleet, and instead they had established permanent defensive installations throughout Keltherin. Space, and the message was clear, and this civilization was under human protection. Now Captain Alina Vasquez had recovered enough to return to duty, and she stood on the bridge of a new ship in the Indomitable. What, too, was a proper warship and purpose-built for the defense of those who couldn't defend themselves, and she had specifically requested assignment to the Keltherin Protection Fleet captain called Lieutenant Morrison from Communications, and she had also requested transfer to the new ship. We're receiving a delegation from the Galactic Council, and they're requesting a meeting. Vasquez smiled slightly. Let me guess, and they want to discuss our ongoing military presence and our violation of about 40 different treaties and our refusal to follow established protocols. That's about the size of it, Morrison confirmed. Tell them we'll meet on the Gentle Dawn, Vasquez replied, neutral ground, and let's see what they have to say. The delegation arrived 2 days later, and representatives from 7 major galactic civilizations, and they gathered in the conference chamber that had been hastily constructed. On the Keltherin refugee ship, and the Gentle Dawn had become a symbol of survival and of humanity's intervention. Ambassador Chen Wei led the human delegation, and beside her stood Admiral Okonkwo, and Captain Vasquez, and Dr. Park, and several other officers who had been present at the battle. The Galactic Council representatives were led by High Chancellor Morthon of the Sivith Confederation, and an elegant being whose species had achieved space travel 10,000 years before humans had discovered fire. Ambassador Chen Morthon began, and his translator rendered his sibilant speech into clear galactic standard. We come today to discuss the concerning militarization of the Rineth system and humanity's unilateral decision to establish permanent military installations without council approval. With respect, High Chancellor Chen replied, we didn't ask for approval because we didn't need it, and the Keltherin requested our protection, and we granted it, and that's between Terra and the Keltherin people. A representative from the Quarren hegemony spoke up. But you've fundamentally altered the balance of power, and for 3,000 years the galactic community has maintained peace through adherence to established protocols, and your actions threaten that peace. Admiral Okonkwo leaned forward. Your protocols involved abandoning the Keltherin to be harvested alive, and please forgive us if we don't consider that peace worth preserving. The harvesters were a known threat, Morthon said carefully, and civilizations learned to evacuate when they appeared, and to rebuild elsewhere, and this was the accepted solution. Accepted by whom? Vasquez asked, and her voice was hard. Not by the Keltherin, and not by the billions, who were harvested over 3 millennia, and your solution was cowardice. Dressed up as wisdom, the chamber fell silent, and several council representatives looked genuinely shocked, and no one had spoken to them this way in living memory. Dr. Park stood, and her voice was calm but firm. Let me tell you what we found in Processing Center 7, and the harvesters kept their victims conscious during the harvesting process, and we rescued Keltherin, who had been in the biovats for 6 days, and 6 days of being slowly dissolved, while fully aware, and you want to lecture us about following? Translator carried his discomfort. We understand your emotional response, but surely you can see that your actions set a dangerous precedent. And what happens when another human-aligned civilization faces a threat, and will you respond with the same overwhelming force? Yes, Chen said simply. If they call for help, and we will answer, and that's what the Terran Defense Fleet is for, and defending not just humanity, but anyone who needs protection, but who decides who deserves protection. Asked a Quarren representative who gave humanity the authority to act as galactic protectors. No one gave us authority, Vasquez replied. We took responsibility, and there's a difference. An authority is granted by committees, and responsibility is accepted by those who are willing to act. The debate continued for hours, and the council representatives argued from principle and from tradition, and from established galactic law and the humans. Argued from morality and from immediate necessity, and from the simple conviction that helping those in danger was non-negotiableizably. Kant raised a hand for silence, Ambassador. Chen and we are prepared to offer a compromise, and humanity can maintain a small defensive presence in the Rinoth system, but you must agree to bring any future military actions before the Council for approval, and you must agree to follow established protocols for engagement. Chen shook her head high, Chancellor, and with respect and no Morthen, seemed genuinely confused. But this is a reasonable compromise, and this allows you to protect the Keltherin while respecting galactic authority. The next time we receive a distress call, Chen said, we're not going to wait for Council approval, and we're not going to follow protocols designed to preserve the status quo, and we're going to help immediately, and we're going to use whatever force is necessary, and if that violates your laws, then change your laws. The chamber erupted in protests, and several representatives stood and shouted and gestured and made demands, and the humans sat calmly and waited for the noise to die down. When silence finally returned, Morthen spoke again, and his voice was tight with frustration. You're demanding that we fundamentally restructure 3,000 years of galactic governance, and that we accept human military intervention as a new normal. And this is unacceptable, then. Don't accept it, Admiral, Okonkwo said flatly. We're not asking for permission, and we're informing you of our intentions, and you can work with us or work around us. But we're not going to stand by while people die, because your protocols say it's too dangerous to help. A new voice entered the conversation. And Speaker Felthus had been sitting quietly in the corner, and now the elderly Keltherin stood on shaking legs, if I may speak more, and nodded graciously. Of course, Speaker Velthius, and your perspective is valued. Velthius moved to the center of the chamber and forearms spread in a gesture of openness. I have lived for 93 cycles, and I have studied galactic history, and I understand the Council's concerns, and I understand the fear that humanity's actions inspire the Keltherin. Paused and then continued, but I also understand what it means to watch your civilization be harvested, and to send distress calls that go unanswered, to know that help exists but that no one considers you worth saving. And the Council speaks of protocols, and of established procedures, and of maintaining peace. Velthius turned to face the Council representatives directly. But there was no peace for the Keltherin, and there was only terror and suffering, and the certain knowledge that we would be abandoned, and then the humans came. The chamber was absolutely silent now. One damaged exploration vessel, Velthius said, and the emotion was clear even through the translator. One crew of humans who had never met a Keltherin, and who had no strategic interest in our system, and who knew they would probably die. And they stayed, and they fought, and they held the line for 17 days, and they saved us. Velthius looked at Vasquez and at her crew, Captain Vasquez, and when I asked why you came and why you were willing to die for strangers, and you said it was because we called for help, and as if that was explanation enough, and for you it was. The speaker turned back to the Council. So yes, and humanity is militaristic, and yes, they are capable of terrible violence, and yes, they operate outside established protocols, but they answer distress calls, and that makes them better than any of us. Morthen was silent for a long moment. Speaker Veltus, and your words carry weight, but surely you can understand the Council's concerns, and humanity's military capabilities are unprecedented, and their willingness to use overwhelming force is dangerous. You know what's more dangerous, Velthius? Replied a galaxy. Where distress calls are ignored because it's safer to let people die than to fight back, in a galaxy where protocols matter more than lives, and where ancient threats operate with impunity, because no one has the courage to stop them. Another council representative spoke up. But the humans exterminated the harvesters incompletely, and they didn't offer surrender. And they didn't follow the conventions of warfare. And this sets a precedent for genocide. The harvesters were Harvesters Park. Interjected, not a civilization and not a species with culture or society or the capacity for change. And they were predators who had refined the consumption of sentient beings into an industrial process, and exterminating them wasn't genocide. And it was pest control, and who decides what qualifies as a pest to be exterminated versus a civilization to be preserved. The representative demanded context decides, Chen replied. Intent decides and capability for change decides, and the harvesters had existed for 3,000 years, and in all that time, they never stopped harvesting and never showed mercy and never demonstrated any capacity beyond predation, and yes, we made a judgment call, and we stand by it.